I grew up in the southern United States, and where I lived, the weather had very, very polar extremes, which is to say, in the hottest part of the summer, it got just brutally hot, not just up over 100, but into the 110s. And then on the coldest days of the winter, it would get down below zero. And one of the things I learned over the years was the weather is just not an interesting thing to talk about. In that part of the world, the weather almost never makes you happier, only less happy, so people just leave it alone. People are fairly stoic about it. But the last few years that I lived there, before I moved to where I live now in the Pacific Northwest, I noticed more and more people complaining about the weather. And I thought, what does this get you? We know that the weather is adding physical stress. It always does that. It's part of living here, so why talk about it? Now, that was on my mind when I got to thinking about, in the founding of our nation, in a lot of the myths, a lot of the narratives that unite us and tell us who we are, a lot of how we teach our children who we collectively are as a people, courage was a very, very, it was a value that tied us together. That the colonists who crossed the Atlantic Ocean on leaky wooden ships had to have a lot of courage. And then the ones who pushed west and lived in the Wild West in frontier communities, they had to have courage. And they didn't have any use for anybody who didn't have courage. And then more recently, we have the mental movie of soldiers coming ashore at D-Day, and we treat them as though they are the best of us. And what did they have? They had courage. And there are other episodes in our founding narrative where you see the lack of courage. There's the McCarthy era, and overreacting to a threat that turned out to be overblown. During the Civil War, there were men who hired replacements and wouldn't go and fight, and instead they paid someone else to do their fighting for them. In the 1930s, there were the isolationists who didn't want anything to do with Hitler and said they can stay on their side of the ocean and we'll stay over here on our side of the ocean and they can take care of their problems. And every one of those episodes, I think that there is a fairly strong consensus that those were not good chapters in our history and that those are not the people that we want to emulate. But today I look around and I'm just baffled because I see so many people feeding fear, wallowing in fear, making radical decisions, some of which will be hard to reverse or even adjust, driven by fear. All that courage was never about not feeling fear. Courage is about feeling afraid, recognizing danger, but then taking firm hold of yourself, putting your feelings in check, and doing the honorable thing and the right thing, even in the face of fear. I mean, doing the right thing when it's enjoyable is really, really easy. You play with a cute baby when it's gurgling and smiling at you, that's a piece of cake. But taking care of a sick and screaming baby when you're also sick, that's where love comes in. Doing the right thing when doing the right thing is scary, that's where integrity and decency shows up. And so what I'm working through this week, trying to think hard about is, where did that go? It seems as though we used to have a commitment to that and that we used to guide our behavior and make our decisions and look up to people who exemplified the kind of courage that recognized danger but took dangerous steps because they were the right steps. Didn't take poorly considered, poorly thought out courses of action because we were overwhelmed by fear. One thought that crossed my mind is it might be yet another symptom of the fraying and rotting of social institutions. In the past couple of weeks, I talked a little bit about the breaking point that seemed to arrive with Nixon and Watergate and this tipping consensus that it had become naive to respect the president, because if the president was that corrupt, that really what you ought to do, the wise course of action, was simply to trust nobody. That to put that kind of trust in your leadership was really just setting yourself up. It was just naive. The problem is if you don't take some chances and if you don't extend some trust, then the institution can't work at all. But I say that because around the time of Nixon is when the United States was embroiled in the Vietnam War. And around that period, if you were courageous, you could be as brave as you like, but a corrupt leader would take your courage, would take your brave sacrifice, and treat it with no honor at all. Just crumple it up and throw it away. And possibly, as we move through that disillusionment, that loss of faith in what bound us all together, maybe that's where we became a little bit less enamored of the idea of doing the right thing because we were brave people. At any rate, the fears that get talked about today, so many of them, I'm not saying all, but so many of them are wildly exaggerated. Wildly exaggerated. They make for very vivid images. And as I've talked about in the past when talking about systems, we're not good at thinking about things that we cannot picture in our minds. I tell my public speaking students this all the time. If you want to reach your audience, give them concrete details. Don't talk in abstractions, because audiences have such a hard time taking something in that they can't visualize. One of the problems that people around me have been not even deliberating, but complaining about lately, and treating in a way that I have to say I find irrational. The city that I live in right now has a fairly visible and somewhat large homeless population. And the amount of public talk that goes on, both in some internet forums dedicated to the city, and also just among people that I know, there's all this complaining about you can find used needles everywhere in the city, in all the city parks, and there are aggressive panhandlers. You can't go downtown because there are panhandlers everywhere. But I don't take anyone's word for it, because I am actually in these places a whole awful lot. I don't own a car. I gave mine away about 4 years ago. And so I walk all around town, and that includes going downtown on foot, which I do repeatedly. And I wonder how many of these people who complain ever really make it around downtown on foot. Mostly they drive to where they're going and they get back in their car and they leave. And I get on the local bus line and I hear people talk about how nightmarish the buses are. But I take a bus trip every week. I take it out and I take it back, and that's not much bus riding, but I go into one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. And I do see a lot of people who they're dressed in very shabby fashion. They're visibly dirty. Some of them look as though they've been sleeping outside. They look as though they're not at all healthy, but they are unfailingly courteous to one another. Occasionally they talk a little bit loudly. They have poor manners, but my impression has been that very much they mean well, that I see a whole lot of kindness expressed. And in all the time I have ridden the bus, I have on 0 occasions, and I mean 0, had anyone on the bus make me uncomfortable. And I also have not observed any interactions between other people on the bus where it was evident that someone was being made uncomfortable. And I have pretty high situational awareness. I do not veg out particularly often. So I think if it had happened, I might overlook it once or twice. I might be oblivious to it occasionally. But if it were an epidemic, if it were happening all the time, I would have seen a sign of it at least once or twice. One more example I'll give, and please bear with me. I know I'm going on and on about this. We have a bike path system that goes through town. And one of my colleagues at the university where I teach has told me twice in the past 7 days that she can't recruit for her cross-country team anymore because the bike paths are just a complete nightmare. It's just wall-to-wall homeless people. It's not safe to go out there. Well, I go out and I run about 3 mornings a week, and I don't do it all the time. It's in my rotation of routes, but one of my routes takes me over almost the entirety of the bike path system. And one of these days, I am really tempted to get my hands on a GoPro and call my colleague out. Say, I went out this morning again, and you know what? I did see one tent. There's one pedestrian bridge that has a spot underneath it where about 1 out of every 3 or 4 times I go, I see a single tent. I didn't see a single other person. Now, the fact that I didn't see them doesn't mean they're not there. They may be off in the underbrush. It may be that my attention is just elsewhere. But that is a path that goes on for 11 or 12 miles. And if they are wall to wall, wouldn't you think I would see 1 or 2 of them? So in each of these cases, I'm not saying these problems don't exist. I am saying they have been grossly exaggerated. Something is going on. And it is this extreme distortion, this very damaging distortion. We as a nation, we as a political unit, we won't put any kind of serious resources into cancer research. We won't put resources into obesity that will actually make a difference. And both of those kill a whole lot of people and do so in a very painful fashion that, if we were rational, would frighten us. But we'll flip out over an ISIS member is going to make it over here and is going to pull off a bombing or a shooting, even though your chances of being struck by lightning, while juggling chainsaws are actually a lot higher than your chances of being the victim of that kind of event. Because, again, this is the kind of thing that is systemic, and what we can hold in our heads as a mental picture seems more real to us than something that is an abstraction. What really, really strikes me is, it seems as though the people around me, both the people I know and the people that I can observe but don't really know directly, they're trying to quiet something in themselves by sounding the alarm. There's some kind of need, there's some kind of hurt, there is some kind of hunger or some kind of anxiety, and they deal with it constantly, and they try to manage it by warning one another of danger, and then by taking sweeping strokes, sweeping action to combat this danger. It kind of reminds me of the stories that I used to hear about soldiers returning from Vietnam, and the hippies would meet them at the airport and spit on them. Well, a few years back, there were some efforts to investigate these stories and corroborate them, and it was difficult to impossible to do. There were a couple of original stories that got passed around like a game of telephone, to where eventually there were 24 different variants on the story, and pretty soon it passed into something everyone knows. It became part of collective memory. But the original stories have some fatal discrepancies in them to where they probably did not happen. Another example is the welfare queen who buys steak and lobster with her food stamps and then hops into her Cadillac. And that story's made the rounds over the years, and it has been thoroughly debunked. Or the ignorant woman, who's usually a woman of a different race, who gives birth to a child and then names it something crazy, like Ladasha or Shitead, which is spelled shithead. No, it didn't happen. No, it didn't happen to a friend of yours. Every time someone tells me that story, it happened to a friend of theirs. No, it didn't. But we seem to have this epidemic of some need to tell this story again. It somehow scratches some itch in us, and if we could figure out what that itch was, we might be on the trail of finding a way to talk to one another in a way that does not continue to destroy our connective tissue, our community connective tissue. And I've mentioned before, there's a theory in the field of communication, cultivation theory. Cultivation theory was the one that was originally about what happens to people who watch a lot of TV, and that they wind up with something called mean world syndrome. Mean world syndrome. People who watch a lot of television, people who are heavy viewers of television becomes to them this magic window that shows them visibly. Because it is a visual medium, it gives them details that it is easy to hold in their imagination, and those details give them this false and distorted impression of what the world is like outside of their immediate vicinity. So if there is a lot of crime programming, then they think that the world is a very violent and dangerous place and there are criminals on every corner. If there is a lot of sexually explicit programming or sexually suggestive programming, then they think that everybody out there is dressing in such a way that everyone is seducing one another. They think that this is the entire world, that this tells them what's going on beyond what they can see. And I wonder if the internet didn't take the effect of television, and it may not be anything as simple as having magnified it, but it did change it. It did, in some ways, accelerate this trend that we now, in our imaginations, create a world that really just does not correspond to what can be observed and what can be confirmed by collecting evidence in any kind of rational fashion. The word courage, the root word of the word courage is coeur, which is the French word for heart. And courage, a good kind of loose paraphrase of the word courage, is what exactly is it that's in your heart? Do you in your heart have mastery, have control over the sensations, over the emotions? And I got to thinking, is the question really what's in your heart or who's in your heart? And something I've talked about over and over again, that the ways we learned, our enculturation, our ways of understanding who is close to us, who are we connected with, who are we united with, those are changing so rapidly. And a lot of people have so much confusion, and that confusion manifests itself as anxiety, that maybe when we're not sure how we relate to one another anymore, when we no longer feel as though the relationships we've had until now, even the secondary and the tertiary relationships, what some sociologists call our loose ties, not our immediate family, but our neighbors and the people in our city, when we can't trust that we have some kind of consensus on the basics and trust that that consensus will last from today until tomorrow, maybe it's that anxiety as multiplied through this conduit of increasingly powerful media that we do not yet understand, because we're still in the first generation of some of these new multimedia channels. Maybe that is what is making us enter into community differently, in a way that the connective tissue has been weakened and is no longer holding us together. What I think is that we are scared by something that's invisible. We are scared by something that we can't localize. We can't pin it down. And what that drives us to do, and frantically drives us to do, is to try to find something visible to fear. The crackpot analogy that I get for this is, if you have ever been isolated someplace and you start to hear a noise, and the noise doesn't sound quite right, and so you look around for what's causing that noise, and you can't find anything that's causing it. Just the fact that you cannot trace that noise down to a source, that by itself that's enough to produce anxiety. And if you were to find what's causing the noise, it could even be something that, if you heard an animal noise and you could look out your window and you could see what animal it was, that's less worrisome than hearing an animal noise and not being able to spot the animal noise. I don't like using this particular image, but it may fit. It could be that we as a community, as a nation, have developed a form of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia as a metaphor, not as an actual medical diagnosis. And by the way, I do not mean the loose and inaccurate misuse of schizophrenia, referring to multiple personality. Multiple personality disorder, or more properly, dissociative identity disorder, is not the same thing as schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness having to do with the fragmenting and fracturing of perception, and it's commonly characterized by disorganized, irrational thinking, and also by hallucinations. They may be visual, they are far more commonly audible, and so you hear voices, and you don't know where the voices come from, but the voices won't stop. So, what I think is, what is once again systemic, changes in social institutions, really things that were always out there but have become more visible, have come out in the open. Changes in just the fact that same-sex marriage is now legal. That was huge. And there were always people who had same-sex sexual orientation. There were always people who were homosexual. But they felt pressured to keep it quiet. And it seems recognizable as progress if what was there and was kept private out of fear is now visible in public. It seems as though if it always existed, Better to know, better for it to be out in the open. But once it is out in the open, it causes a lot more anxiety. I have this talk a lot of times. My mother is 83 years old, and so for her, the world that she's living in today is even more radically removed than the world she grew up in. She was born in the 1930s. She was a child in the 40s and a teenager in the 50s. So the world today is really, really different, but some of the things I point out to her that she finds so distressing, I say they always existed, they just weren't reported on. So things like domestic violence, things like child abuse. You hear all these horrifying stories of men stalking women, of women having to leave marriages because men are very, very violent. And in some cases, it is a woman who's violent. That happens. But I'm not going to pretend that that happens in an equal or even comparable number of cases, because it doesn't. It's disproportionately men putting women in danger from violence. And then something similar with child abuse. It was going on, but until it was reported, we didn't necessarily all know about it. And now that we know about it, if it was out there and we were ignorant of it, then it's progress for it to be more widely known, because then at least we stand a chance of one incident at a time reaching out and helping people and rescuing people. And over the years, we can spot some patterns and we can figure out some more organized interventions that can do something constructive. But it's also the case that when we know about all of this, that we're confronted with it. And being confronted with it can produce a lot of anxiety. Sometimes I teach in a couple of my classes a theory called uncertainty reduction, and I've talked about it in past episodes, that what motivates us to communicate is that we feel uncertain. And uncertainty is aversive. It feels a little bit like hunger. It doesn't feel like hunger, but I draw an analogy to hunger. When you feel hungry, you feel motivated to go and eat. And when you feel uncertain, you feel motivated to go and communicate, because as you communicate, your uncertainty may come down, and then the anxiety that accompanies uncertainty may come down with it. Now, I say all of that to say there are certain circumstances where that model has not held up well, and that is that people often don't want to reduce uncertainty if they're pretty sure that if they find out the answer, then they're not going to like it. And one of the variants on uncertainty reduction theory is a theory called motivated uncertainty management, and where people feel as though either they would not be able to reduce the uncertainty, or if they got the answer, they wouldn't like what they would hear. In that case, they learn typically just to live with the uncertainty. And one example of that is there are circumstances under which patients actually will not go to the doctor, even though they're pretty sure there is something wrong with their health, because it's better to live without that answer that may be a really terrifying answer. It may be a death sentence or being sentenced to something degenerative that's going to be terribly painful. And once you know, you can't live in the uncertainty that lets you keep it at arm's length. And I wonder if today there aren't a lot of people who, with changes just in the past couple of generations in social institutions, if all these things that were kept private, if there aren't people who the particular form their regret is taking is they feel as though they were better off not knowing. And of course, I don't want to lowball the reality that there are people who really don't like the changes and don't find them to be progressive at all. I mean, I haven't been talking about it much in these episodes, but I am very definitely a Christian. And my value system is what I have learned from the Bible. And what the Bible teaches me about what God intended for my life and what God wants me to do, how God wants me to conduct myself to conform myself to the image He originally had for me, the image that was represented in Jesus, what Jesus did, what Jesus taught. And so I know that a lot of the people who are also fellow followers of Christ, fellow believers in Christ, that to them these changes are not at all progress, that they're actually, to them, a deterioration of values. The part I never know how they explain away is this was all being carried on in secret, and the thing that changed was it came out in the open. And I know that there are arguments to be made about, well, you don't have to give approval to it, things that are done in secret, it would be better that we know about them in the open so that we can minister, so that we can teach. And I don't know, if I tried to get down, maybe that's what I need to get to next week. I know I have not talked much about my faith and where I think my faith factors into all of this, so possibly that needs to be the next episode. But to try to reel that thought back in, I know that there's something about this particular kind of anxiety, and I know that I think I could go out and talk to people. I think I could talk to people all across the country, and I think I could talk to people in my own neighborhood, and I think explicitly there would still be a consensus that courage is a good thing, and that we identify ourselves as a nation and as a people as the ones who do things like land a man on the moon, because we will do things that are dangerous. We will look straight at the fear, and we will say, this is frightening, but it's worth doing. It's the right thing to do, and you have to take some risks in life. And we will get involved in World War II when we are attacked, and not only in the Pacific theater, but we'll also get involved in the European theater, and we will become the arsenal of democracy, and we will stage D-Day, and we will mount this assault, even though we're going to take terribly heavy losses, because it is the right thing to do, because this is a situation where bold responses are required of us. You know, Winston Churchill, one of my favorite quotes from him is, it's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes we have to do what is required. And doing your best, getting yourself killed is not necessarily doing your best, but it could be what is required. So I think, to reel this thought back in, I think I could go out and talk to the people who are part of my community, and they would agree that those are all still true. But there's a disconnect. There's a short circuit. And we're not behaving in that fashion. There is something about the anxiety that is very widely and commonly experienced, where people are turning to comfort, where it pushes beyond, where people will hew to their values, where people will recognize this is an opportunity to be courageous. And instead, what people do is they are vulnerable, they are open to the kind of fake reassurance, the kind of soothing reassurance that gives them a moment's relief. And I think that too many people on all points of the political spectrum have been giving in to appeals and promises that are really very cheap, that are bypassing our critical faculties. And I don't know, maybe that's another episode in the future. I've already done an episode on criticism, but criticism is not the same as critical thinking. It's not the same as healthy skepticism. Maybe what I need to figure out, what I'm seeing in front of me, is what has happened to the kind of skepticism that lets you go to shop for a car and listen to the car seller make a spiel about how wonderful the car is, and still, while smiling and being pleasant and being civil, saying, you know what, I'm not going to get suckered. I would have thought that that was a part of what we thought was being a competent adult. And that was something that we valued in ourselves, why we educate every one of our kids, because we trust individuals not to be suckered. We do not have a cultural shared belief that we have to take care of one another. We think that individuals are agents who can resist being manipulated and swindled. But it seems as though there is something about this kind of anxiety that is undermining not only our ability, but really our willingness to exercise that. It's almost as though we are looking for someone to follow and follow blindly, and we are treating it with great hostility when the possibility is floated that we are being suckered. And I know that I have talked about accuracy goals and directional goals in information. I've talked about Brendan Nyhan and the backfire effect a bunch of times. Something like that is happening here, but it's braided up together with the anxiety, and somehow these causes are interwoven. And so one of the symptoms that we just seem to have turned loose of the idea that it's important to be courageous, when that idea was so much the bedrock of our founding myths, so much how we identified ourselves. There's something going on with this. So next week, probably it'll be about my faith, but I've got to come back and figure out what's going on with this too.